Hello, and welcome to another episode of Life is a Scale Model. Before we jump in today, make sure that you like this video so we can beat the algorithm, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so that you can see all the cool stuff we've been working on lately, and we'll be working on in the future. We're just going to dive in today. We're going to be doing some sanding and filling. I am going to be using some Tamiya plastic filler as well as this Vallejo plastic putty, which was recommended to me by one of my viewers to see if we can't get some of the warts cleaned up on this Enterprise from Star Trek, the original series today. As you can see, I already did a little filling in the last video. I went ahead and I filled the gaps in the nacelle pylons where they meet the engineering hull, but we do have some gaps at the top of the nacelle pylons as well, where the nacelles fix to the model. So we're gonna dive in and just give that new Vallejo filler a try here. As you can see, it's got a really narrow nozzle. I thought that was a great idea for applying your filler to basically just the places where you wanted it and not getting it, all spread around and messy all over places on the model you don't want it to be. Now I'm told that the advantage that this Vallejo filler has over some other brands that I've tried over the years is that it's acrylic based, which means it's pretty easy to wipe away with just water. So I was told by the viewer who recommended it that all you have to do is place it in the seams where you need it to go and then take a wet Q-tip and wipe the excess away, and as simple as that. And I figured, well, what better application than filling these teeny tiny seams between the warp nacelles and the pylons. And so as you can see, I've wet myself a Q-tip, and now I'm just going to town, wiping away all that excess, manhandling the model, because sometimes you just have to manhandle the model to make sure you exert your dominance. I kid, but yeah, we're just gently using that Q-tip to get in those little crevices there and wipe away all that excess filler that we don't need in order to fill that seam. And as you can see, we did a pretty good job once I get it in focus and in the frame and stuff. We've just got a teeny tiny bit of filler in between the nacelle and the pylon, and I declare that it's good. So we are going to do that again on the other nacelle. I will say that process of filling that seam and wiping it away much faster than my traditional filling and sanding process that I use when I'm using the Tamiya putty. Not that Tamiya putty doesn't also have applications where it excels, but when you've got just these really tiny seams like this that just need a little filler, I feel like this Vallejo plastic putty is a great way to go to make life easier and simpler. There's no need for us to make life more difficult than it needs to be. Life already does that for us, probably on the daily anyway. So once again, I have filled the seam with the plastic putty. I'm just wiping the excess away. And now I'm going to use it in a place that gave me quite a few headaches the last couple of times I built this model. We're going to use it on the seam between the neck and the saucer. This is a notoriously difficult place to fill seams, as you might imagine, because, well, it's a tiny spot and it's hard to get in there with your sandpaper and your sanding files once you've got that filler in place, and it's hard to make sure you just get the filler where you want it, as opposed to, getting it all over the place. So if you're not careful with more traditional fillers, it can end up being quite the arduous task to get cleaned up. But as you can see, all we're doing right here is we're just wiping the excess away with the Q-tip. Easy peasy. And I think probably I will call that the number one biggest victory for Vallejo plastic putty. Again, I'd like to take a second and give a shout out to the viewer who recommended it. He knows who he is, or she knows who she is. It was definitely an eye-opening experience for me giving this new product a try, and I highly recommend it for people who want to do life on easy mode. So you'll see I'm using my thumb here on the seam line between the two halves of the saucer, and I pointed this out last time we were here, and it just got a little area where the saucer halves just don't quite mesh. And this is an application I feel is better served with the Tamiya putty, because I've got a rather broad area where I need to bring the two surfaces of the model into alignment with one another, which requires a wee bit more filling. So I wasn't quite ready. I didn't have the courage to just jump in with the Vallejo stuff and see what kind of results I would get. This felt like an application better suited to something I was a little bit more comfortable with. And it's definitely important when you're doing model projects and whatnot that you try to be conscientious of what you're comfortable with. That's not to say that you shouldn't strive to try new techniques and new tools that might streamline and make your process a bit easier, but you don't want to jump into such a deep area that you find yourself in over your head. And so what I've done here is I've filled that spot. So now those two halves should line up level with one another, and I'm just taking my putty knife there and I'm just kind of scraping away the excess that I can see, so that when I have to go back and sand, I will not have to worry about sanding a bunch of putty off. I can just sand a bit. And that too will also make the process a little bit faster, a little bit easier. Again, there's no reason for us to make life more difficult than it needs to be. And I'm just going with my fingernails around the rest of the saucer area to make sure that there aren't any areas that don't line up properly. Now that everything is filled and our putties are all dry, it's time to jump into sanding. And these pylon connections between the warp nacelle pylons and the engineering hole tend to be a little difficult to work with. If you want to be a smarter, not harder modeler, you might get the kit built up to where the pylons are fixed to the engineering hull, but maybe not put the nacelles on before you get in there and clean it up. That'll give you a little bit more wiggle room to get in there at various different angles and really do a good job with the sanding. But I didn't do that because I like to work harder, not smarter. And so here I am, just trying to fiddle around the nacelles and trying very hard not to get too carried away so I don't accidentally break one off. I'm going to use a variety of tools though in this process. The sandpaper, especially the 60 grit, as I've talked about before, is a great kind of middle of the road grit where you can sand excess material off fairly quickly, but the grit is fine enough that once you've got primer and base coat paint sprayed on there, you really can't tell too much that the model was sanded. And for getting these areas where I can get my fingers in, it's really a good tool for that. It just gets in there and it gets all that excess filler putty out, and it just makes quick work of it, and I like it. I'm just trying to get the very last bit of putty off of that nacelle pylon, so when we spray it, it won't look odd with its excess putty on there. And I'm just checking to make sure the two halves of the engineering hull line up okay. I will say my engineering hull with this particular mold of the kit is a little bit more oval shaped than circular. There's definitely a little bit of warping that's taken place during the casting process, and I know I harped on it many times in the last video, but I really feel like AMT needs to give this tired old model a facelift and give the old TOS Enterprise the love and care that she deserves in 2500 scale. So now I'm done with that. With that sandpaper, I'm going to start using some of my files to get into the smaller crevices. You're about to witness my impatience personified, as it were, because I'm starting with this finer grit file. It's just designed to take a little bit at a time, which is definitely what we want. We don't want to rush things. We don't want to get in a hurry and get careless. But sometimes my ADHD and my impatience went out over my desire to be careful. So now I'm pulling out my big guns. These are my diamond tip files, and they cut through stuff a lot quicker. So if you're going to make the decision to use diamond tip files over regular metal files, please make sure that you're extremely conscientious of not removing too much material, because these diamond tip files cut through things quite quickly. Quite quickly. Say that one 4 times fast. And if you're not being careful with them, it's possible that you could start taking away material that you didn't want removed. But they are quite wonderful when you just want to get the job done. But desperation breeds ingenuity, and I had what I thought was a pretty good idea, and then it took me a few seconds really to manifest that idea in the way that I foresaw it in my brain. But as you can see, I'm just taking that piece of sandpaper I was using earlier. I'm not completely folding it. I'm rolling it more into like a barrel shape. And in my mind, what I saw going on was I could push on that and it would give enough resistance that it would kind of conform to the surface of the model. And fortunately for me, it actually turned out the way that I had envisioned it going, which is a rarity in my workshop, because usually I envision things going a particular way and I don't think them through very quick, and then I end up with a catastrophe on my hands. But this is one of those rare times where I had an idea and it actually worked. But now I'm just going to get into the places where I know the sandpaper would not be able to get, again, because there tends to be a little bit of a bump in the nacelle pylon piece. I did try to minimize that when I put the model together, but it just isn't quite possible to fully get rid of it. So we're just going to try to get some of that excess putty out and make sure everything is good and clean before we start putting paint and primer on things. Now I'm going to go ahead and sand the excess putty off of that saucer edge. And I'm not necessarily sanding the part where I filled that depression between the two halves of the saucer, specifically because I want to make sure that I get a good straight edge with that. So as you can see, I'm going with my diamond tip file now, and I've got it at a bit of an angle so that it matches the angle of the rest of the saucer. And I'm just trying to match up that angle on the saucer's edge so that it's as consistent as I can get it all the way around the edge of the saucer. And finally, I'm going to take some finer grit sandpaper, and I'm going to go over quite a few spots where I've done some sanding, just to try to blend out some of those fine swirl lines you get when you're sanding things. This is my OCD kicking in, and me not being terribly happy with the feels of holding the sandpaper. I'm a weirdo, and I embrace that completely. But if you're watching, you've just kind of unofficially signed up to go along for the ride. And I'm just looking things over now to make sure that everything is buffed, as it were, to my satisfaction. You might notice we still haven't put that deflector dish on yet, and we're going to get to that in a little bit and look at why we haven't done that just yet. The aft section of the engineering hull looked a little bit rough, so I just went ahead and cleaned that up. Then I was like, oh, this is a model that has two sides. I should clean up the other side as well. Video proof that I am a bag of hot air, blowing my sandpaper pieces off the table. Some people might recommend that you wet sand. There is an advantage to wet sanding. One, you don't get dust everywhere like I've got, but two, the wet sanding process keeps the grit of the sandpaper clear, and it makes it work a lot better. Now here's a lineup of all the colors I'm using today. As you can see, it's not a very big lineup like it was with the NX01. We don't have as many details to paint because this was just a much simpler model from the 60s. So we're going to start where I always like to start, which is details on the bottom of the model. There is a reason behind that. It's the way I spray things, and so it just feels natural to me. And speaking of spraying things, the theme of the week was I'm fighting Mother Nature to get my video done. And so the reason you didn't get to see me prime and base coat the model is because I got all of that filling and sanding done, and just as I was setting up my equipment to get footage of me spraying things, the rain came. So I got everything primed outside where I usually prime, and then it took me a minute to get to the point where I realized, oh hey, I have a garage. I could spray my base coat in the garage. But if you would like to see the painting, the priming and the base coating process, I recommend you go back to either my original NX01 or my NX01 refit videos, and I definitely demonstrate the process on those videos. Hopefully my neck of the woods will not be throwing fits weather-wise for a little while, and I will have some good weather to continue doing my projects and bringing you great advice on how to build these models without the encumbrance of fighting the weather. It really is hard to fight the weather. So I went ahead and I painted the little sensor dome that is featured on the bottom of the saucer there. I'm going to start painting the back end of the deflector housing here, which, according to my Haynes manual, is the same color as the dish, which on larger scale models I would definitely paint copper, but being as this model is so small, copper would probably come across as a bit dark. So I'm using the same color brass that I used on the NX01. I feel like at this scale it's a light enough shade that it really fits the scale of the model. So I'm just kind of carefully going around each ring and making sure that I'm getting my paint everywhere I need it. You might notice a bit of a change from the last video where I painted. I have adopted the use of rubber gloves, or latex rubber gloves. It's just an experiment. I tend to have greasy, sweaty hands, and when you're working with models, you don't want oily things to get on your model because that could impede the ability of your paints and your primers and your decals to stick to the model properly. So I'm testing to see if the benefits of wearing the gloves outweigh the hassle of wearing the gloves, because it is definitely a much different experience painting when you're wearing gloves as opposed to not. I didn't realize how much I rely on being able to feel how I'm holding the brush, and the gloves definitely distort that feeling. So if I look like I'm a little bit awkward, it's because I am. At least this first time around, change is always difficult, and I was like, no, I don't like this. But I am going to give it a shot for at least a couple more times before I really come to a conclusion on how I feel about it. Or, my alternative is just to make sure that I wash my hands pretty often, which is never a bad thing. I got some paint where I didn't want it to go, and so now I'm going back with a wet Q-tip, and I'm trying to get as much of that excess paint off the model as I can. I broke one of my first rules with this particular model, and I felt okay doing that because I've done it before, but as I've explained in the NX01 model builds, I like to use paints for my base coats that also have brush paint counterparts. Yeah, see, there I am trying to show off my beautiful work with my brass paint there. The reason I like to use spray paints that have brush pot counterparts is because you spray the base coat and then you get into detail painting, and inevitably, if you're like me, you get other colors of paint in places that you don't want them. Alright, so there's our deflector dish that we modified last time. I apologize for the terribly bad framing and spastic movement. I have the camera at a new angle so that hopefully you guys can see what I'm painting better, but it's a little bit awkward for me to put stuff closer to the camera, as it's the first time I'm using this particular camera angle. But back to where I was with base coat colors. So, you get colors that aren't the base coat color in places where you just want the base coat color, and then, oh no, what on earth am I to do? And if you're able to buy a pot that you can use a brush with, you just open your pot and stick your brush in there and then paint over the spot where you accidentally got wrong color paint. But for the base coat color of this particular model, I used Tamiya Light Gray IJN, and I searched for probably a good hour or so on the internet to see if there was a brush pot counterpart, and there just wasn't. But I really like the way this gray looks on this 2500 scale model. So I said, well, to heck with it, we will just do what we can. Now we're painting the bridge dome. I'm using ivory for that, as that's what the Haynes manual kind of looked like. The reason I'm not using white is because at this scale, white is in my opinion, is going to just look way too bright, and it's gonna try to hurt your eyes. And now we're gonna start painting the impulse engine housing. I'm going to be using London Gray for impulse engine housing, as well as a few other things, so I'll point that out. So the moral of the story with the base coat color is, if you cannot find a base coat color that satisfies your personal tastes and aesthetics that also has pots for brushes, there's a little trick that the internet assures me is okay to do. I didn't want to be sharing things that I thought would be awful and terrible. I don't want to be imparting any bad habits to you guys. But if you find yourself in this conundrum of, I've got this perfect color, but it only comes in a spray paint can, I can't find a bottle for a brush to save my life, when you get done doing all of your detail painting and you go back to clean things up, one thing you can do is you can take whatever you're using as a palette, and you can take that spray paint and spray a glob of spray paint on the palette, a very generous glob. And then take a brush that isn't one of your good brushes, get yourself a ratty old sacrificial brush, as it were, and just use your ratty old sacrificial brush and that blob of spray paint and do your touch-ups. Tamiya spray paint in particular, its aerosol and binding agents tend to cause it to dry rather quickly. That's why I recommend a generous blob, which I know seems somewhat counterintuitive, like why would you want to waste that much spray paint? But I promise you, you're going to want to waste that much spray paint, because what's going to happen if you use just a thin coat is it's going to dry real quick and you're not going to have anything to dip your brush through. So if you have it built up a bit thicker, it's going to give you a little more time to work with the paint. This is also a good practice while the paint is still fresh and wet, going back with your wet Q-tip and trying to get paint removed from areas that you don't want it. I set myself back about half a step here because I actually did just take off paint from the impulse engine housing that wasn't supposed to be removed, but I was having kind of a weird day, so we'll give me a pass. We'll fix it. But yeah, just bear that in mind. You can use spray paint as a brush paint if you believe hard enough, and if you have a ratty old brush that you don't mind potentially losing. I actually didn't have too much trouble with the paint wrecking the brush. I think part of that comes down to having a good paint thinner with which to clean my brushes. So that might be something that you look into doing if you haven't already. Get yourself a good paint thinner or brush cleaner, and that will definitely alleviate some of the potential headaches of using spray paint as a brush paint. We're going to do that again when it comes to the Enterprise refit with this next project, because I love the way that the pearl white looks on that particular kit, but Tamiya does not make a pot of pearl white that you can use with a regular brush. And I did not actually record myself doing touch-up this time, but I will specifically record myself doing touch-ups in the video with the Enterprise refit so that you guys can see kind of how that process works. I just wasn't sure if I should be imparting this piece of pseudo wisdom to you, because it'll wreck your brushes if you're not careful, and it can be a dicey prospect doing the whole process of using that spray paint with your brushes. I don't want people getting up in my comments and saying, you told me to do this thing and you ruined my $15 detail brush. I hate you. Yeah, I don't want that kind of stuff. I want to give you guys good advice, sound advice, practical advice. So I really had to think about that one. But at the end of the day, it was really the only option I had left when it came to fixing some of my boo-boos that I made uh, while I was doing the detail painting. And if I have to do it, I'm not going to hide that from you guys. I'm going to be straight with you, and that's just what I had to do. Here I'm just being real careful not to get that London gray anywhere it's not supposed to be. The deflector housing, wow, I'm at the wrong part of the ship. The impulse engine housing is kind of tiny at this scale, and it can be a little difficult to see where the impulse engine housing stops and the rest of the saucer starts. That's why I typically wear magnifying glasses when I do detail painting, because even though my eyesight, by all metrics, at least as far as I've been told recently, is pretty good, uh, it never hurts to have a little extra help when it comes to seeing really tiny things. And when you're working at 1/2500 scale, you're going to be looking at really tiny things. So that might be something that you also decide you want to invest in. I personally use some 3 times magnifying glasses. Now you see me just kind of wiping the model with my brush, and I'm dipping it in water and I'm wiping it. I put some of that London gray on the neck where I definitely didn't want it and didn't notice. And by the time I did notice, it hid right on there. I'm just trying every method I can think of, short of getting paint thinner on something and potentially ruining my base coat, to clean that up. But now I'm happy with that. It's time to manhandle the model again because my fingers were feeling really clumsy. But I'm just going over that deflector housing one last time to make sure that everything is covered properly. I didn't take any more paint off than what I had intended to take off. And there I go, being clumsy again. I got London gray on the nacelle. Fortunately, I caught it fairly early that time, so I was able to get it wiped off with the Q-tip before it dried too badly. I was not born a graceful person, so I just work with what I got. So this London gray is going to get us really far on this model because we're going to do the impulse engine housing on the saucer with it, and we're going to paint the fins on the nacelles, on the rear end of the nacelles, and we're going to paint the nacelle end caps with it, and we're even going to paint the fins on the warp chiller grills that are on the inside of the nacelles with London gray. It's really gonna take us real far. Again, just work carefully. I apologize that even with a new camera angle solution, I still can't keep things in frame. Enjoy my fabulously big bombastic hair. Shout out to my barber for making me look beautiful. But yeah, with these real small details, just try to work as meticulously and carefully as you can. You might notice I'm shaking quite a bit. I don't usually have that issue because one of my unofficial rules for myself is, if possible, I try to put the model on a solid surface that doesn't shake, and I try to reinforce my hand that I'm painting with on something that is solid and not shaking, so that my body doesn't have to do as much work holding things steady. Because I've learned in days gone by that that solution just doesn't tend to work very well for me. As much as I try to have a steady hand, I usually end up getting in trouble when it comes to painting because I get all shaky and I get nervous. So, if you need a little help, that's okay. Better to accept a little help than make a boo-boo and get a bunch of paint where you don't want it. So we're just getting those fins painted and cleaned up. They're teeny tiny. At larger scale, there actually is an opening between the fins themselves and the main body of the nacelle, and so the fins are kind of more in like a D shape, as it were. But painting that London gray in that little crevice just helps it to blend with the rest of the model. And now that I got the starboard nacelle done, I'm going to go back and do the port nacelle the exact same way. Once again, it's just a matter of being careful and being patient and being meticulous and just trying to stack the odds in your favor as best you can when it comes to how you're holding the model and the brush and whatnot. Maybe someday I'll figure out a camera angle where you guys can watch me paint and not see my hair. Let me know in the comments, though, what you think. Do you like seeing my hair, or should I find another camera angle so that you guys can see more of me painting the model? Personally, not to influence your vote, but personally, I would vote to have you guys be able to see more of me painting the model. It's tough with those glasses, though. If you're a veteran of using magnifying glasses when you paint or work on models, you probably know the struggle. You have to get within a certain distance of the model itself before they focus properly. So it's a tightrope. How do I get the focus I need so that I can actually see what I'm doing without getting my big hair in the way of demonstrating to you what I'm trying to do on the model? That's just me looking at the nacelle fins and being pretty happy with it. So now I'm going to paint the fins that are in the warp chiller grill on the insides of the nacelles. Just going to basically do the same process. They're actually more or less the same shape as the fins that are on the rear of the nacelles. So I'll get those done pretty quick. But you can see with just this little bit of color we've added, it really does start to bring a little bit of life into that model. We've got some contrast now, and some of those details, even though there weren't a lot of them originally on the Enterprise since it was built in the 60s, you know, they're still enough to make it come alive. So now I got the fins done. I'm going to get to the end caps here. I've looked at multiple different sources to see what the color scheme should look like, and I have gotten conflicting reports, so I just I try to leave the little bulbs the same color as the base coat and just paint the rest of the end caps the London gray. I'm pretty sure I picked that up from one of the Art Asylum Starship figures I owned in days gone by. I keep saying, though, one of these days I'm going to get up to Washington, D.C. to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum and get me some good high-resolution pictures of the original 11-foot Enterprise filming model so that I can have a bit more accurate idea of what the filming model looked like back in its prime. And I highly recommend if you have that capability, it's not something that you'd have to go too out of your way to do. Absolutely go ahead and do it. Regardless of if it's the Smithsonian and you're going to see the original Enterprise, or you happen to be somewhere where one of the other filming models is on display or whatnot. Um, yeah, as much as you can, get in there and figure out how to make it happen and see the actual models in person. Because you really can't beat hands-on experience when it comes to researching and figuring out what your model is going to look like. So yeah, maybe someday in the near-ish future, I will make a pilgrimage to see the original Enterprise. I do have quite a few pictures I took of it a really long time ago, back when it was still in the basement. But I've been informed over the years that while it was a pretty good approximation, it wasn't necessarily a very spot on representation of what the ship looked like back in the 60s. And even though it's been nearly a decade now, I just haven't had that opportunity to get up there and see what the curators did with the model when they did the big restoration back in 2016. But once again, we're doing another nacelle end cap. This time we're on the starboard side. The process will be basically the same. I'm just going to try to avoid the bulbs that poke out of the end there. Just get the little, I call them the spoilers, because they kind of make the thing look fast. I'm just going to very carefully go around the whole nacelle and put paint where I want it. Try to avoid putting paint where I don't want it, so I don't have to do touch-up painting as much when I get done. One thing I should be doing that I'm not, um, even at 2500 scale, these nacelle end caps have a bit of texture that runs lengthways down the nacelle, and I am currently painting against it. You might find slightly easier success if you paint with that texture instead of fighting against the grain. Only reason being, it's going to make it a lot easier for that brush to put paint and pigment down between those grooves. But that was me being in a bit of a hurry, and so yeah, I didn't think of it before I just dived in. Now I'm doing some rings that exist at the front of the nacelle, right behind the Bussard collectors, and according to my Haynes manual, which is kind of my go-to guide for doing these Enterprise builds, it's a little bit darker gray than the London gray that I'm using for the other parts. So the color I opted to use is Vallejo gray green. Sorry, I couldn't remember if it was gray green or I had also considered, for other reasons, using Vallejo green gray. Very confusing. But as you can see, the gray green, I mean, it almost looks black. but not quite. When you see it in person, it's actually, I mean, it's very dark gray, but it's most definitely a gray when you look at it in person. Those are not too bad. They're just a steady hand and work your way around the model, and just be careful not to get the paint outside of the rings. Now we're doing the Bussard collectors, and as I did with the NX01 and the NX01 refit, I am putting down a coat of silver, and I don't remember who turned me on to this process, so I apologize if you happen to be that person watching. But somebody years and years and years ago, when I first started building Star Trek models again, suggested that if you're not lighting a model, you're just building something static, but you want the illusion of something being lit up, you can use silver under a translucent colored paint, and you can create that illusion, as it were, of an element of your starship that is in fact lit up. And I've done it on several models, including the ones I've done for the channel so far, and I tend to enjoy the results of it, and I like the aesthetic of it. It may not be your thing. You give it a try, you decide, you know what, I'm not really down. But it's something that I enjoy. It just adds a little bit more, for lack of a better word, life to the model. So we'll start with that silver base coat on the Bussard collectors. And once we've got a good, reasonably smooth base coat, that's when we're going to move on to painting our translucent orange on there. At one point, I had the idea of taking one of these 2500 scale Enterprise models and trying to mock it up as the ship would have appeared in Star Trek the Animated Series. And I haven't shelved that idea yet. I'm not totally averse to the idea. It's not something that I think is prudent to do while we're doing our 2500 scale project here. But, maybe someday just for fun. And when I had that idea, less experienced me was like, oh, it'd be really cool to do is to start with a white base on the Bussard collectors, and then take a dark gray and paint that that shape that you see animated on the Bussard collectors in the cartoon, where it's got kind of a little circle and then some spokes that flower out from the circle. So that when you paint over the translucent orange, you really do get this sense that, oh, hey, there's something going on underneath, and that looks pretty cool. I don't know. Like I said, maybe someday in the future I will have the time and the gumption to just do that as a side project for funsies. But right now I'm working real hard for you guys to bring you some great model building content. And I love it, and I don't want to stop, so we're just going to keep going on that. You can see, though, with that translucent orange going over that silver, it really gives it a great luster, and compliments to whoever bought my filming lights, because they just cast all sorts of light just everywhere, and you can really get a sense of just how lively that translucent orange looks when you put it over that silver. The trick is to not be too thick with it, because the thicker you put it on, the less translucent it's going to be. So you don't need a super thick coat. You just need a good, smooth, thin coat. But you can kind of tell how there's just a little illusion that the Bussard collector is glowing. Obviously, it wouldn't be. It's never going to be nearly as good as like shoving a light. But at 2500 scale, it's going to be hard to shove a light in that Bussard collector. These little guys were not really intended to be lit up. Mostly, we'll cover ground with that later. But once again, I got paint where I didn't want it, so I'm cleaning it up. Now that I got the port nacelle done, it's time to go back and take care of my starboard nacelle. And you can see in the frame my old man magnifying glasses. I'm not even ashamed. If it works, it works. That's the most important thing about doing a hobby, and especially when it comes to scale modeling. Find what works for you, and if it works, it works. Just do it. Don't worry about what other people would think. I mean, modeling in particular is not a hobby typically that you do while other people are watching. Some of y'all might get to where you feel comfortable taking your models to like model competitions and conventions and stuff, and that would be great. And if I happen to be in attendance in the future, I'd love to see them. But you're still not going to be like actually building and painting models in front of people. So just put together whatever system works for you and stick with it. For me, wearing old man magnifying glasses works because it helps me to be more precise with how I paint my models. Not sure why I felt like I needed more paint there. I'm just trying to fill in holes to make sure that everything's covered. I don't want any of that silver to be showing through. But that's going to do it for this week. I really appreciate you dropping in and watching the video. Again, give the video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I look forward to giving you more content in the next couple of weeks. But until then, you have a blessed day and happy modeling.